Archaeoden update from Archaeodeath.
My third ever TikTok live, and we're going to try and talk about a very specific issue today about the archaeology and heritage of the Ukraine. And I'll start in a couple of minutes and just give you a perspective from me as a professor of archaeology on what's going on in the Ukraine and the UK and the international reaction to the threat to its cultural heritage. So I'll do that. I shall start in just a few minutes, but and I'll talk to you about that. But welcome everybody. I'm still on my annual leave, but I thought this is such an issue that could be put off at any point, to any point, but I think it does need to be addressed at this point. What is actually going on in the Ukraine, and what is the reaction, and what can heritage professionals and archaeologists do about what is mainly a humanitarian crisis in a war zone, something which really we can't really do much about it in a direct and practical way, but we do have, I think, a responsibility as a community of international scholars and me myself based in the UK to do something, say something at least. So my contribution is simply going to be to read out what other people have said so far, reflect on it, and then hopefully give you guys a chance to ask me any questions. I'm not sure I'll have all the answers, but to try and answer any questions about what I think is going on in terms of the international reaction to the Ukraine's the threat to its cultural heritage. So it's almost the hour, so I shall get started and just start talking. And I won't answer questions immediately. I'm going to be reading out quite a lot of statements by international organisations, but I will answer any questions that relate to the specific issues of Ukraine's archaeology and heritage at the end. So I'm not ignoring your questions, but I will get to them at the end. So obviously we're in a situation where the obvious starting points, the provisos, are that this is principally about living people and an ongoing war zone situation, and that's something I'm not an expert in, I can't comment on. And any discussion of cultural heritage has to be aware that anything we say is secondary to the humanitarian crisis, that buildings, monuments, landscapes, art is never as important, should never take priority over, or human suffering and human living circumstances. So there's been such a, every time you bring up cultural heritage, people immediately say, well, you only care about stuff, you don't care about people. Well, no, as has been made clear by many of the Ukrainian authorities themselves, they see the current war as a circumstance that is affecting directly the culture of the past of the Ukraine and its future. That this is a part of not only an attempts at a regime change and military and political transformation, aggressively, but it's also an attempt to eradicate and disrupt the cultural heritage of the Ukraine, a very new nation, but one which has a deep past with many complex stories to it. So in that regard, just to start up with, by talking about cultural heritage is not disregarding or displacing the needs of current people and in a crisis situation. So I just want to say that it's easy to do a whataboutery. Yeah, what about this? The other point of whataboutery you've seen a lot of is, well, where were you talking about other war zones, other conflicts? And there's ongoing global conflicts from East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula. There have been many others going on in Southeast Asia. Where were you talking about those issues and those? And I must admit, this is new to me in terms of talking about new events and ongoing events. So I won't claim that I was there talking about all those other war zones and issues. So I'm happy to take that as a criticism, but I think it's an important point. This perhaps is a point where we have to change, if we, at some point as a community, and start talking about these global and international issues from an archaeologist's point of view. So those are the provisos. As I said, I'm not going to answer questions straight away. I'm going to actually be reading you some of the statements of how other organisations have responded, and I'll try and answer some of the questions about the archaeology and culture of the Ukraine near the end. Okay, so the first point is that since the war started, we've seen a number of international organisations and UK organisations making statements about the Ukraine's cultural heritage. And I'll start off with Blue Shield International, who on the 25th of February, within 3 days of the start of the special military the war, they issued a very abrupt statement. Now, Blue Shield International are a group of they describe themselves as a network of committees of dedicated individuals across the world committed to the protection of the world's cultural property and concerned with the protection of cultural and natural heritage, tangible and intangible, in the event of armed conflict, natural or human-made disaster. And they regard themselves as the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross, formed in response to changes to international law and today's work on a global scale to protect cultural heritage in emergency situations. They're a non-governmental, non-profit international organisation committed to the protection of heritage across the world, including museums, monuments, archaeological sites, archives, libraries, audiovisual material, and significant national areas, as well as intangible heritage. They have national committees operating around the world, and they coordinate with an international committee called the Blue Shield International Board. And they said, very simply, within 3 days, the Blue Shield is extremely concerned regarding the escalating conflict in Ukraine. We will ask all those involved to obey all relevant international law and to protect the civilian population wherever and whenever possible. We stress in particular the responses to those involved under the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict and its two protocols of 1954 and, where relevant, 1999. That was an international committee. From a UK perspective, the senior academic and scholarly society, the Society of Antiquaries of London, issued a statement on the 1st of March 2022. It's quite a short statement again, and very similar. And it says, the Society of Antiquaries of London condemns the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. As stated by the UN Secretary General, such operations are violations of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and are inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations. The Society supports the calls from UNESCO and Blue Shield International for respect to international humanitarian law. Notably, the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict and its two 1954 and 1999 protocols to ensure the prevention of damage to cultural heritage in all its forms. The Society also calls on those involved in the conflict to obey all relevant international law and to protect the civilian population wherever and whenever possible. So I'm really mimicking Blue Shield, and also I should have said the UNESCO statement that also followed a similar line. So we have, within a week of the war starting, the Society of Antiquaries of London echoing Blue Shield International and UNESCO. It then took until March the 18th before the Heritage Alliance in the UK, who are an organisation who I should say describe themselves as established in 2002. The Heritage Alliance is a membership body which represents the independent heritage movement in England specifically. As such, it has a unique role in protecting the sector in all its diversity, and they represent built heritage, community heritage, and public engagement, culture and memories, industrial, maritime and transport heritage, archaeology, conservation, landscape parks and nature, academia, blah de blah. And they said they wrote a letter to the Minister of Culture of the Russian Federation, Olga Borisovna Yevdamova, and this was part of a letter that was had a broader letter on the threat of Ukraine's heritage, saying, as shelling continues to major Ukrainian cities, including the capital Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Odessa, and now in the west of the country, Lviv, we are deeply concerned at the loss of life and the loss of tangible and intangible culture, architectural heritage, art, monuments, archaeology, and the collections of art and antiquities. William Morris, founder of Britain's most ancient conservation group, whose ideas have had a huge influence on the conservation movement worldwide, including in Russia and Ukraine, believe that historical buildings are valuable for what they tell us about people, and therefore we contend they are inextricably linked to human suffering at the time of war. Moreover, Russia, as a signatory of the UNESCO 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, that sets out legal obligations to protect culture and heritage in the event of armed conflict, this international agreement must be upheld. Russia is only too aware of the great losses incurred to its own historical palaces and churches during fighting in the Second World War. We urge Russia to halt the shelling of Ukrainian cities and to end the inevitable loss of human life and architectural heritage that it is incurring. Kiev is the home to UNESCO World Heritage Sites, St. Sophia Cathedral and the Church of St. Cyril, along with related monastic buildings and the complex of Kiev, Pierska, Lavra, and with the Church of the Saviour of Benestovo, which was inscribed as Heritage of Humanity under the 1972 World Heritage Convention concerning the protection of the world culture and natural heritage. Kharkiv is world famous for its constructivist and Art Nouveau legacy, while Lviv is one of the great Renaissance and Baroque cities of the world. Odessan culture, including architectural heritage, is utterly unique. Chernihiv has outstanding ecclesiastical heritage that has lovingly restored after the Second World War by both Ukrainians and Russians. We deeply lament the loss of any important buildings in these cities and others not listed here, the significance they hold for their inhabitants and for the world. We note in particular the vulnerability of historic wooden structures for which Ukraine is so famous. We urge you to do your utmost to end the war, which creates an increasing threat to both life and cultural heritage, and to plead the case with your own government for the avoidance of further destruction of cultural heritage in any form during the war. While bombing continues, loss of life and the damage and loss of historical buildings, collections and sites is inevitable. We are a group of UK conservationists, architectural historians, archaeologists, cultural commentators, authors and campaigners who built heritage and wider cultural heritage, and we have united this week to monitor threats and losses to architectural and cultural heritage in Ukraine during the war. And then the signatories of that are a long list of organisations and individuals, including Lizzie Glithero West, FSA, Chief Executive of the Heritage Alliance. Okay, so this is rather bland and dry stuff, but the reason I'm going through it is to give you a sense of how international community of heritage and archaeology professionals and organisations has responded. I'll get to questions in a little while, if I may, but I think it's really important to give you the sense. Now, the European Association for Archaeologists, which, but as the name suggests, is the Europe-wide society representing archaeologists and heritage professionals, announced on the 24th of March, and this immediately after the Heritage Alliance statement, that they created a signatory to a wider statement by archaeological organisations worldwide. This came out on the 24th of March. It's under a month ago. And again, I want to read it in full because I think it's important to do so. Archaeologists, anthropologists, historians and others who study the past depend upon open international cooperation because human interactions in the past were not restricted to modern borders. However, the invasion of Russian armed forces into Ukraine compels us to raise our voices as associations representing archaeologists globally. Respect for fundamental human rights, respect for the sovereignty of independent states, and compliance with international law are prerequisites for scientific and cultural international exchange. In the strongest terms, we condemn the invasion of Ukraine by the armed forces of the Russian Federation and demand an immediate cessation of military activities. Protection from harm for both the people of Ukraine and the rich archaeological and cultural heritage they curate is our highest priority. We endorse the 1972 UNESCO World Heritage Convention and the 2003 UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, and specifically the current statement issued by Europa Nostra, signed by scholars from more than 30 countries. And I that's another one I could have read out, and is another potential point of discussion. But anyway, the Iron Curtain divided Europe and its archaeologists for two generations. Scholars have carefully built bridges between Western and Eastern European research and heritage management over the last 3 decades, and which the EAA has been an integral part, I should add, as a preface. The demons of war now threaten a new Iron Curtain, curtailing collegial and professional relations once more. We cannot sit by silently and witness this happening again. We express solidarity with the people of Ukraine and also with the many Russian and Belarusian scholars who maintain an independent, fact-based approach to understanding both current and past events. The Australian Archaeological Association signed this. The European Association for Archaeologists, the Register of Professional Archaeologists, the Bolivian Society of Archaeology of La Paz, the Society of American Archaeology, and the World Archaeological Congress all subscribe to that statement. Okay, so we're coming up to where I'm going with this, which is what this actually, where this leads us in terms of the last month. So we then saw on the very almost identical timing, well, 2 days before that EAA statement, British-based archaeologist Mark Barkman-Astles, who I did a YouTube video and recommend, he's on TikTok as ArchaeoSoup, and his colleague Andy Brockman, together endorsed an hashtag ArchUK for Ukraine, where they pointed out that while statements had been made, many of the UK organisations and individuals had yet to individually state what they could or might do to about this exceptional situation within the specific context of European archaeology. And they called for particular 3 organisations, the CBA, the Council for British Archaeology, CIFA, the Chartered Institute for Archaeology, and FAME, the Federation of Archaeological Managers, or some such acronym, to do something, to say something, to make statements themselves about what they might do. And they asked for the so this is the first time that there's been a bit of criticism of the pace and character of the archaeological response, and they asked specifically for a joint statement to be made of solidarity with Ukraine, to highlight the government's sponsorship scheme, not though widely accepted as the less than the bare minimum that other countries are way ahead of this, but at least to point that out for people forced to leave Ukraine, which we're looking at millions and millions, most of whom are going to countries immediately around, and which the UK has so far accepted a paltry, tiny amount. But they said we should at least highlight that. Create an initiative enabling archaeological units to sponsor archaeologists who've been forced to leave Ukraine and offer support in kind to Ukraine's heritage community in country. Some kind of organised or coherent statement or management of what we do as a community of scholars and researchers and practitioners. To explain the importance of the Hague Convention on Cultural Heritage in Conflict Zones, including the preservation of Ukraine's heritage and the recording of alleged cultural war crimes. 5, to name the stakes of highlighting to the public the ways culture and historic sites are at risk in conflict zones and what they can do to help. And sixthly, and finally, to read the room, because while these organisations have been active in commenting on inclusivity and ethics, they have remained silent on this particular issue. Subsequent to that, on March the 25th, one of those 3 organisations, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, which is mainly for the professional bodies, did issue a statement via their website that in the past weeks, many nations have set up schemes which enable their citizens to host people who are seeking refuge from the conflict in Ukraine. CIFA and the European Association for Archaeologists, that's the European organisation I talked about before, are collaborating to provide an opportunity for Ukrainian archaeologists seeking refuge to make contact with other archaeologists willing to house or employ them. At this stage, we do not know the level of demand nor that of assistance that will be offered. The EEA has launched a dedicated webpage to assist refugees for Ukraine, and they put the link to that, and is collecting details of Ukrainian archaeologists and their families in need. If you are able to house one or more of these colleagues or their families, please put in touch. So they're picking up on one of the points made by Andy and Mark about putting people in touch to actually do something to help specifically archaeologists in Ukraine. So this brings us into the month we're in at the moment. And you'll have seen that in the news, by this point, we start to see that the UNESCO are reporting on the scale of cultural sites that are being damaged in Ukraine. And the Guardian story, for example, of the 1st of April, at least 53 culturally important sites in Ukraine damaged, according to UNESCO. A true list of casualties of war, which include museums, churches, and a Holocaust memorial. And you'll remember that the shelling of a Holocaust memorial in an attempt to denazify the country. You can't make this up. And so, like so much of the things on the news at the moment, you can't make it up. So UNESCO said that overall 29 religious sites, 16 historic buildings, 4 museums and 4 monuments are confirmed to have been damaged. On the 8th of April, this is now onto the government website, the UK government, ukgov.uk. There's 46 members of the UNESCO committee on the World Heritage Committee, UNESCO World Heritage Committee, have written just to address the scale and character of the damage ongoing, highlighting the cultural heritage of Kharkiv. The World Heritage Convention is then quoted, and the 45th session of the World Heritage Committee was due to be held in Kazan and under Russian presidency, while the latter is destroying outstanding universal value in Ukraine. And they pointed out that the credibility of UNESCO and the 1972 Convention concerning the protection of the world's cultural and natural heritage is at stake. Given these circumstances, signatories to this letter, as all stated parties to the 1972 Convention, will not travel to Kazan or to the 45th session of the World Heritage Committee hosted in any other country if chaired by Russia. So beginnings of a process of not only of protesting through withdrawal from and questioning Russia's role as signatory to these conventions. UNESCO report on the 11th of April, the damage to cultural sites is now verified up to 90 sites, including 44 religious buildings, 6 museums, 25 historic buildings, 3 theatres, 11 monuments and 1 library. Okay, so that's the situation up to this point. But today I'm back from holiday and I've received my copy of the Council for British Archaeology's popular publication, British Archaeology. And there is some more information I can share with you about what's going on, because there is a short statement by by Neil Redfern of the CBA, the director of the Council for British Archaeology, on Ukraine, in the opening section on page 6 from the director, where he says this: "We are all aware of the devastating war in Ukraine and the destruction and the impact on people's lives, a part of which is reflected in the letters page of this magazine. As a small charity promoting archaeology in the UK, the Council for British Archaeology, CBA, is not in a position to take an active role in proffering advice or campaigning about the war and its effects on heritage. However, as director of the CBA, I say we fully support the people of Ukraine and those organisations who have a direct role in helping them. Their suffering is in the forefront of all our thoughts." Okay. And the letters section does contain 2 letters that must be now at least a month old, from page 46 onwards. But I do think they are worth reading because they do make they give further details of where heritage and archaeology bodies and individuals stand in the circumstance. And the first letter is from an important individual in this context, because it is from Fedir Androschuk, the Director General of the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in Kiev. And he says, "As I write, it has been 10 days since Russia invaded Ukraine." So this is now a letter published now, but dating from the very beginning of March. "I would like to share some experiences and observations I have made about the impact of this event on my work and duty as Director General of the National Museum of the History of Ukraine. First, don't expect any clear instruction or guidance from your chiefs. Things happen much faster than they are able to deliver a decision. On the eve of the war, very few regular people, as well as politicians, believed that war will actually happen. Panic is the worst thing at this time. That is, why any signals of worry from museum directors could be ignored by the Ministry of Culture. Even if there is an elaborate plan showing how museums should act during military conflicts, there is a lot of practical obstacles that make its implementation unrealistic. I think that's pretty academic language, but it's pretty stark. Basically, yeah. And as usual, I think this goes from beyond the Ukraine. People don't give a toss about this stuff until it's too late to actually worry about it. I think that applies beyond the Ukraine. Anyway, that's just my commentary. Let's get back to what he says. The Russian attack on Ukraine was launched at 5 o'clock in the morning. I was awakened by a colleague telling me that Zuliani and Bolokspil city airports have been bombed. Forgive my shite in pronunciation of Ukrainian place names. I've no experience of of talking about them or using them before this reading. How many of my museum colleagues were expected to see this day? Many have parents, families, kids and pets. They are all terrified at the sounds of sirens, shells and the roar of aircraft. Even those who are obliged to be there, administration and the chief keeper, can't be available because of logistic and or communication problems, or because they're simply afraid. So in such circumstances, the only stuff you can rely on is devoted people. We don't find devotion listed in job specifications. It can be revealed only in unexpected emergencies like this. And while I claim not have to have no experience of a war zone in any capacity, that does ring true of other circumstances I've come across in my archaeological career. Now it is difficult to believe, but on that grey morning I found at the museum about 20 devoted people. Collection keepers, technical workers, carpenters, guides, researchers, librarians and law experts. They all contributed to disassembling exhibitions and packing exhibits. The experience of the Second World War shows that looting and aircraft strikes are typical dangers museums can face. Evacuation can make sense if you have at least a couple of weeks before military operations are activated in your area. The ideal solution is the evacuation of exhibits by air. Evacuation by trains has its bad sides. The railway can be demolished. The train can be damaged by bombs or rockets from the air. Facing eventual occupation of the city, the Ministry of Culture, if it is still active and not on the move, or museum administration need to make a decision about the collection and exhibits on display. If you are certain that the army of occupants will respect the international law of protecting heritage, you may skip the dismantling of exhibitions. However, this is not the case in Ukraine. During the time of the Russian Empire and then Soviet Union, many archaeological, numismatic and other objects of Ukrainian culture were moved to Russia and found their place in the showcases of such Russian museums as the Hermitage and the State Historical Museum. There is no guarantee that, in line with Putin's denial of Ukrainian statehood and identity, Ukrainian cultural heritage will not be subject to mass robbery. So I have made the decision to remove and hide all exhibits. If you have a large collection and a very limited time, it is necessary to establish an order of priority. In 1970, in the Soviet Union, quote, instructions concerning the protection of museum and artworks from the means of mass damage was issued. It is still pretty much an issue that most post-Soviet countries. According to it, objects should be classified into two categories. The first comprises items of national and world importance, unique relics, as well as rare objects of natural history, of great importance in terms of history of science. The second group includes similar categories of objects that have primarily national significance. Both groups have special distinguishing marks that enable easy location in showcases and museum stores. Timely evacuation or placing of exhibits in specially prepared underground stores are recommended for objects of the first group. Items in the second group need to be evacuated after the security of the first group is completed. The selection of both groups needs to be undertaken by competent teams of experts. They compile a list of objects of both groups specifying their number, size, weight and volume, and finally orientation for the planning of packing materials and transportations. Irremovable objects should be listed in a special catalogue and need to be protected on the spot. This is basically the main principle according to which we have undertaken work in our museum. Once all exhibits have been removed and hidden, the museum turns into a huge storage. I think it means huge store. Its public work is limited to online activity. This means you need to have a good, competent team of writers able to deliver good quality text adapted to a wide public, focusing on museum items. People can't visit the museum, but they can still be interested in watching and interpreting the museum's objects. Such conscious destruction of the exhibitions is a preventative measure to keep the museum's collections safe from possible looting. At the same time, this dramatic moment can be considered as a crucial point for the beginning of a new museum. It is a time for rethinking the narrative of previous exhibitions and considering possible new roles for the museum. And just in case you missed it, those are the words of in the CBA, latest CBA magazine for May-June 2022 by Fedor Androschuk, who's Director General of the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in Kyiv. And he is, as you well know, a Viking period archaeologist. He's written a lot of superb papers on burial archaeology and weapons, in particular from the Viking Age. You'll know the work of Fedor. Now, there's a second letter in CBA, and I said I'll come to questions at the comments at the end, but I want to go through this second letter too. And this is anonymous. This is from an archaeologist known to be to the editor who wishes to remain anonymous, and we'll see why. I'm about to leave Russia, where I had arrived 48 hours after the beginning of this, quote, special military operation against Ukraine. I have good reasons to be here, and I never really felt personally threatened. Our Ukrainian colleagues are facing risks on a totally different scale. I know of 2 archaeologists participating in the defence of Kyiv, while another one is being evacuated west to Lviv. The northern Ukrainian town of Chernigov in older maps, where the oldest Orthodox cathedral of Ukraine and one of the most famous archaeological monuments of the country, the Black Barrow, the Chanaya Bogila, a burial mound of the 10th century AD, are located, has been the target of sustained rocket and air attacks. I have heard speculation that part of the reasons for this attack may be the ideological significance of Varangian sites, i.e. Viking period sites, for the origins of the Rus state, in brackets, one of Putin's stated motives of intervention in Ukraine is his own conception of Russian history, end of brackets. And while specific reports are still lacking, there are understandable fears that other historical and archaeological monuments may be damaged too. But there are also consequences for Russian archaeology and archaeologists which are gradually becoming clearer. I was asked last week by a British colleague to do a local payment for a publication license for an image supplied by a Moscow museum because such payments are no longer possible from abroad. A small thing, but hot on the heels came the press statement from the German funding body which supports my project in Central Asia. They will discontinue all joint projects with Russian institutions. That embargo is bound to hit the Russian experts and laboratories doing contract work for my project. I will not be allowed to pay them from German government funds, and even if I were allowed, I could not transfer the money to their Russian accounts. Such cooperation bans will be bad for Russian institutions which have tried to become more international, but they will have a devastating effect on exactly the people who deserve it least, the next generation of archaeologists. Last week, one of our students, a very good and highly motivated girl, phoned with the news that her foreign scholarship and research trip has been suspended by the Polish hosts. She was crying while she talked to us on the phone. Other students have been arrested for attending anti-war demonstrations or writing in opposition papers, the last of which has just been closed down. There appears to be a sense of disorientation spreading among our students here. The fear of general mobilization with a call-up of former conscripts, in brackets, the Kremlin publicly admitted a couple of days ago that conscripts had been with the Russian army in Ukraine, is leading quite a few to contemplate, quote, trips abroad. Russian archaeology may well face another brain drain on the scale it experienced after the collapse of the Soviet regime. But it is not only young archaeologists losing opportunities and perspectives at home and abroad. A senior colleague has cancelled a planned and firmly arranged papers in the UK because even if she should get a UK visa, which is now out of the question, She tells me that she could not possibly face a foreign audience now. In addition, she would have no money for of her own because she would be unable to use her credit and account cards while outside Russia. At the same time, in at least one case I know of, an official has attended a staff meeting at the Academy of Sciences openly pointing out the consequences of the new fake information law, in brackets, passed by the Duma, the Russian parliament, on the 4th of March 2022. All research staff are state employees. So if anybody disagrees with government opinions, they should look for employment in the private sector. Last week, some 100 university and high school rectors signed a letter of support for Putin and his policies. One suspects that they were not given much of a choice, and some may just have wanted to protect their institutions. In this way, political, financial, social and psychological barriers are going up within and around Russia. Barriers which will damage archaeology and scholarship in general across the continent. It is a small tragedy accompanying the big tragedy of Ukraine. I happen to know who's written that. I can tell exactly who's written that, but never mind, I'm not going to say that down here. Now, there is a third little letter coming from the University Archaeology UK, who are representatives of academic departments in the UK. UA UK is appalled by the current situation in Ukraine. Above all, we write to condemn the loss of human life in the region and the displacement of millions of innocent civilians. We stand with colleagues in Ukraine and the wider area who are suffering the effects of this terrible conflict, including Russian colleagues opposed to the war. We are also dismayed by the impact this war will have on the archaeological record and cultural heritage assets. Ukraine is home to 6 World Heritage Sites, with another 17 on the tentative list, and multiple museums housing rare collections of international importance. We highlight the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict to ensure the prevention of the destruction of all forms of cultural heritage. UA UK urges all colleagues to explore options to support Ukrainian archaeologists through their own institutions and networks, particularly through CARA, the Council for At-Risk Academics. That's another organisation or a link I didn't mention before. So, in 34 minutes or 35 minutes or thereabouts, I've brought you up to date with where the international and particularly from a UK perspective sector stands on the Ukrainian conflict in terms of published statements. And I suppose my own reflections are perhaps not fully formed and are provisional and are ongoing, but I am again this mixture of feelings about the situation and how I've seen people manifest their ideas and opinions via social media and via other websites and blogs and so on. And I must say, depending on what I'm reading and how, I've gone from a sense of solidarity and pride at my colleagues and the organisations to a sense of shock and disgust at the platitudes and the vague and bare minimum approach to some of the statements and contents. I think it's really interesting to see how it does take people to ruffle feathers to get and extract statements. But it's also very disturbing and odd that while people are willing to make statements via social media, others will only put things into a print-only magazine or accessible to members via their website magazine. So I have some feelings about where and how and what people have been saying, and I'm not trying to advocate I have any experience or knowledge of the situation. I don't have any solution of what to go forward, but I wanted to outline to you, anyone listening. I see there's a few people here. Hello. What's been going on, and to see what we can do. I do like the idea that CIFA and EAA are putting together, just facilitating those able to support Ukrainian archaeologists and their families. I've done some private stuff that I'm not going to talk about behind the scenes in my own capacity of writing and support for those doing that as well. But I think that these organisations have reiterated the international statements of concern about Ukraine, about its people, about its cultural heritage, but they've also sort of made some specific practical points in the direction. Just looking at your comments, how is any of this being upheld? What can be? I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? I mean, monitoring is an ongoing. Just as we've seen war crimes being documented, the digital capacity of satellite imagery, of the volume of video footage. This is all going to be feeding into a picture of monitoring, but and in a way, with a capacity like never before for prosecuting in some future date, depending on the outcomes of the war. There is the potential for it if we have that record, that monitoring of damage being done. But it feels hardly, there's nothing that can be done to really intervene beyond that, I imagine. There is always looting and destruction during war, but what's really shocking is you have national museums who are, quite from what Fedir says, really in a position where they're left to their own devices to make up a strategy. And I've got no insight into Ukrainian politics, national or local or regional, city, civic, but I can well imagine that the abstractions of what you should do because I think the time he's writing is now out of date. I mean, it looks like Kiev is not going to fall. I mean, that's my sense of what's going on. And that, but when he was writing, I mean, the fact that we only read these words now, a month and a bit after they were written, a month and a half after they were written, is frustrating in itself. But my point would be, Fedir was clearly anticipating the Russians being in the city within hours, if not days. And it's about, the question of, are they on the ground? Well, no, I don't know. I don't know if there are people on the ground doing this at all. I don't know about that. That's interesting. So Shay821, hello again. Nice to see you. You make the point that there's been many individual websites and universities. Yeah, there's been lots of, general university statements I've seen as well. And the scale of general popular support in the UK is phenomenal. I've just driven across Wales, and the number of Ukrainian flags out more. I saw more Ukrainian flags than Welsh dragons, or a comparable number. But in terms of, it seems unlikely that the UK unis will openly critique the government taking only a few refugees. No, they won't, and they'll do as bare minimum, just as they do with all these other. They'll label it in a oh, we're very concerned. We support those that can maybe help, and yeah. So it is a bit banal, if I may use that word, if you know what I mean. So this is the question about, do you think international conferences will ask Russian scholars not to attend, or will they not attend anyway? Well, from what, so I was going to say the name of the scholar, the anonymous scholar is saying, how can Russian scholars attend conferences, attend events, attend international, deal with international funding projects with the embargoes? If they were to attend, would there be? So if in that circumstances, is there any point in a posturing performative, ban on Russian cultural exchange if it's impractical anyway, or do we need to move to that level of actually having a proper, as happened in South Africa, a proper embargo on Russian scholars and international exchanges? So I think there's going to have to be some kind of international statement on what happens with Russian scholars, Russian students, Russian institutions moving forward. I don't think it'll happen from an individual student basis. It'll happen individual institutional basis. It'll happen on a national or international level. But it is certainly something that's going to be well discussed. And there'll be those on both sides. Those going, oh no, we don't want to exclude Russian colleagues who are also opposed to the war, but they can't speak out. And there'll be those saying, sod that, as with other countries where there's been similar arguments, and such as Israel, we need to keep a long-standing embargo on cultural exchange to to try and affect, to show the international community, is it not going to tolerate this kind of activities. And yes, I've seen. So I have seen a reference being made to the, as J8121 says here, about how much headway has been made in digital databases of cultural artifacts and sites, because we've seen that in Syria, we've seen that elsewhere, where you'd be surprised the number of tourist photographs that have become invaluable in records of sites years, months, weeks before their complete destruction. And how much a systematic archaeological record will help and assist in either their restoration, because remember, there's always issues of authenticity, but whether it's historic sites after the First World War, Second World War, or more recent conflicts, reconstruction work. These monuments, these sites, if damaged, are not doomed by if damaged. They can be restored, they can be rebuilt, they can be reconstructed. But it's a massive amount of money, time, work, energy, and perhaps it takes years after the more priority to other the restoration of infrastructure such as hospitals, schools. It's down the list maybe, but it's an important part of what might happen. So detailed records of structures and sites and landscapes is going to be key. But of course, this is all about, a lot of the discussion is about World Heritage Sites and this kind of aggrandizing this World Heritage hit list of cultural artifacts. The thing is, as all archaeologists know, landscape is a cultural artifact, the whole landscape of Ukraine. Now, you may say, oh, well, a lot of the things I teach in the UK are about 20th century sites, are about early medieval landscapes. They're not protected as landscapes, but they're absolutely integral and important, and they contain many hidden sites that are being trashed by large scale, would be trashed by large scale bombing and destruction. So, as with all archaeology, we're never going to know the full damage, the full level of destruction, when many sites are not even known about and not even fully recognized. So I think there is a whole issue there about we'll never know the full cost of a conflict such as this on a cultural landscape. So you have this kind of real challenge, and it must be said, it is also an issue of, this is not secondary. Some people say, oh well, this is not as important as the real humanitarian crisis. But as people in Ukraine are rightly saying, destroying literal objects of history underpins the metaphorical fabric of it. Yes, its importance is being eroded, is being damaged, and this is what the war is. War takes place on many fronts, and we see this is an active, systematic aspect of military engagement, is the targeted destruction of cultural sites. Now, I'm not in a position to judge whether the Russians are actually targeting or just are so incompetent that they are hitting civilian targets, and it's quite clear that in some cities they are just absolutely obliterating, and they've had history of doing this in Syria and in Chechnya. They're not targeting the historical sites; they're targeting the entire space and the people within it. But my point would be, I'm not, and we don't have the position. We're not in a position yet to fully evaluate the extent that this is deliberate targeting or just incompetent conscript troops with equipment they can't properly use. And that's true of any conflict, whether you call it collateral damage or not. It's part. But these cultural, the very act of encircling and trying to starve out civilian populations is going to have a massive impact on culturally sensitive historic cities. Yes, and we are in a different world, as Che821 says about the conferences being hybrid and the potential of hybrid. The digital nature of cultural heritage and the recording of it, but also the sharing of it and the discussions of academic going digital is going to be important. And what really shocks me, and this is another bit of disgust I've had with some of my academic colleagues, is not only because the pandemic is allegedly over, we have individuals saying, oh, we should just go back to face-to-face conferences like we used to. And that's nothing to do with the Ukrainian conflict, but it shows that there are academics who I think are living in a very weird little bubble. In the same with some of the more anodyne and frankly insultingly generic statements by some that I've read out, you do wonder whether people are living in the real world. um, and we are in a new digital real world as well, where hybridity of conference formats makes should be an unintended consequence, a positive unintended consequence of the pandemic, global pandemic, that means that we shouldn't be restricting scholarship to exchanging ideas and debates via attending a specific place at a specific time. And that's what I've been pushing a lot on. I wasn't obviously. I was obviously saying allegedly over. I totally respect that the pandemic is far from over, of course. But here in Wales, the restrictions on mask wearing have only recently been lifted, and it's been a very odd and disruptive period of seeing the distinction between English and Welsh towns, cities, villages, populations, and how they've been given different regulations to follow, often conflicting with each other. But then, particularly in healthcare environments, of course, they are still expected and they are still required. I can imagine. I can imagine. But I think the link up to the Ukrainian discussion is the issue of how international scholarship dialogue with individual colleagues who are not, it's not their fault, and in fact, how much does the international community go to make Russia a pariah, to use that phrase which I've heard criticized, but that how much do we isolate Russia, and what becomes constructive and pressured, and how much actually causes long-term damage, as that second anonymous writer was talking about the next generation of scholars and students from Russia. I mean, I certainly know that I'm old enough to remember. I'm old enough to remember when I was doing my PhD back in the 90s. This is within a few years of the fall of the Iron Curtain. Well, not a few years, but a good 8-9 years. But you see the EAA and these European conference where you can have an exchange with a Macedonian scholar, a Bosnian scholar, a Polish scholar, a Russian scholar, and a Swede, a French. Not the French ever turn up, but and Danes, and and English and Irish. In other words, that full span, and of course the Americans are always there. But you have a Europe-wide conference which genuinely has representatives from across proper Europe and beyond. Asian, African scholars and American scholars too. So you have that sense of this is a world where only very recently are we in a time where those dialogues have happened, and people forget that very quickly how much of a luxury we've had in the last 30 years to have those cultural exchanges. And I talk about this in my courses on the Viking Age, for example, how so much of the Eastern Viking story is still linguistically and intellectually cut off because of the legacy of the Second World War and the Cold War that came after it, and how we're still really struggling against that divide of understanding the Viking diaspora, the Viking world, and how most of the books and popular scholarship about the Vikings is really about a quarter, a third cake slice of the Viking world, the North Atlantic and the British Isles, with Western Scandinavia, and perhaps a bit of France and Iberian Peninsula as well, Francia and Iberian Peninsula. We don't get the Byzantine, the Abbasid Caliphate story, let alone everything else going on, the Khazars and so on. We don't get that archaeology coming into the books, into the popular perception. So it's a real where we've had a luxury. So the question is, moving forward, will this be the moment where, rather than it being the Cold War being over, this was actually like I don't know what's the right phrase. I'm trying to think of a climatic equivalent. This is a warm phase, a very short warm phase. Back into the ice age we go. You know, my climate phrasing fails me there. But will we see now a now freezing of relationships where Anglo-American scholarship is now separated by Brexit from continental European and Scandinavian scholarship in a way that hasn't happened in 30 years. And now we'll have another divide with Russian Federation scholarship. And, you know, for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you know, which is very sad to think about the longer term implications of this. So beyond Ukraine, or whatever happens in Ukraine, if we survive a nuclear holocaust, you know, there's another doom mongering. You know, let's assume that doesn't happen. You know, will we now be facing a new divide? You know, so there's issues like that. And Byzantine studies, I imagine, where scholars conflate personal religion with research. I'm not sure what you're getting at there in terms of, you mean that, you know, as well as nationalistic biases, there's religious biases. That there's so many intersecting. We go to medieval studies conferences, and it's, you know, very heavily, there's a Catholic and an Orthodox dimension to that. It's very interesting to see. But also you have, you know, religion, politics infects and affects the academic discourse. And and archaeology, this is the thing, this is bringing it back home. What really worries me is the broader narrative beyond Ukraine. No, I'll answer this question by Becca Hinark. I don't know how you say his name. Becca Hinark. Hello. Is there a feel for the current impact to archaeological resources in eastern Ukraine? I don't know, actually. I haven't seen enough specific commentaries on it, because it's beyond the museums, isn't it? It's about the broader landscape, because they're trashing huge amounts of landscape. I mean, you see the abandoned trenches of Russian soldiers in central Ukraine. Is Kiev is central, isn't it? It's not, or is it the east of Western? I don't know. The abandoned trenches of Russian soldiers. You know, the landscape's trashed. It's not just rubbish. It's like, you hardly surprising. You know, this is war, isn't it? It's a complete devastation of the landscape. So yes, I mean, it's going to be years, months, decades even before an audit of damage to the broader cultural landscape is undertaken, and bring it back, you know, home. A final point, or another point to make. I'm still happy to answer further questions if you have any. A further point to make is, you know, this is again archaeology as it said here by Ism not Wasm. I don't know how to say these online names. It says, you know, archaeology seems to be overlooked and important after the fact. Yeah, so people only care about shit when it's gone. It's true of everything, but particularly archaeology. People say, you can say about the NHS as well. You can say about so many things, but you can particularly see it with cultural landscapes. Oh, it was good when we had a nice old church. I never went to that church because I'm not religious, but still proud of that church. Or, you know, we have some wonderful archaeological collections in the local museum before they're all looted. Isn't that a shame? And while Ukraine is obviously a stark extreme, the broader lesson for the UK is not lost, is that we have spent, you know, decades neglecting and denigrating and indulging narratives that would see heritage, historical research and archaeological research as luxuries, as silly, frivolous additions. And whether we're combating extremist narratives or simply trying to talk to school kids about their local archaeological sites, it's always secondary. It's always neglected. It's always that's the first thing that the local government cuts. Our universities, why should we be teaching subjects that aren't vocational? Well, they are vocational. That's the thing I always say to people about archaeology and heritage degrees. They're actively vocational on a whole range of strands. But, you know, in terms of popular perception, they're not vocational. And then you look at what's happening. Well, certainly, you know, dictators, totalitarian states, fascists, communists, and everyone else in between, they know the value of heritage, and that's why they destroy it. And, if we allow in Western democracies and elsewhere, we indulge a view that, oh, this is just fluff, this is luxury, then, well, I'm personally in that luxury, non-crazy, crazy cat lady. I'm an indulgence. I'm a frivolous fancy on the universe, of course. But I mean, the broader sector, I think, is not an option. If you want to have a future that has an understanding, a rich understanding of its past, to counter the old cliche of lessons learned, and if you forget your history, you're set to revisit it. But also, genuinely, a society is in understanding, proud of, and rich and informed by the diverse, complex story of Europe, of nations, of regions within nations, of localities at every scale, to understand our human story. We're not going. We can't indulge this moving forward. This idea, because if Ukraine, obviously, This was about the Ukraine situation, but I'm just trying to put it out in a broader sense that this is just another warning of what could easily happen anywhere. Not necessarily Russia, really. I'm in terms of how cultural heritage can rapidly disappear if we allow it to, or circumstances that we can't expect um, take over. Oh, that's cheery stuff, isn't it? But I did feel I wanted to at least do a little reading of the key letters. Unfortunately, I'm going to put this up on my Archaeodeath YouTube channel, and I'll put in the links. And I would encourage you to look at the watching brief on ArchaeoSoup. ArchaeoSoup on YouTube has a fantastic series of recent videos talking about the situation. He's much more professional in his approach than I am, but I'll put all the link. Check out ArchaeoSoup. Unfortunately, the letters I've read out in British Archaeology are not accessible, although ArchaeoSoup does have a direct link to them. I think they made them open access, but they seem to have glitched and taken them down. But anyway, I'll put up all the links I can for those who want to follow it up, and I'll upload this for Thursday 6 p.m, which is like my usual day and time of the week for my YouTube uploads, and so that this conversation is archived. And while it isn't perhaps the most coherent of statements, and it's obviously everything's interim because we don't know what's going to happen next. I hope that was of some interest and some use. And thank you for tuning in and for your comments. And I hope I have some more cheery topics to address in lives in coming months, rather than this kind of doom and gloom of mass destruction and the threat of mass destruction. So cheerio for this evening. I'm going to drop off. I've got loads of YouTube videos from my holiday, my TikTok videos from my holiday to share with you. All sorts of cultural heritage sites that are not being destroyed that I can share with you from Southwest Wales. But I'll see you soon. Thank you, and have a good evening to you guys. Thank you. Bye now.
Sadly, we're all going to die. But while you're waiting, why not follow Archaeodeath? Subscribe now on YouTube.